introduction. There we go. Already got started for me. Excellent. So welcome to this is number 3 in the series of speaker series. And today we welcome Oren Adcox. You're still currently a grad student, right?
I just finished, so within the last year,
this up, right? This is your final bit, right? Getting this done and getting it turned in. But basically, you've gone through the graduate program, got your master's in game design, which is great. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the premise and what your thesis was for that program. So, as always, thanks to those who are joining. Thanks to those who are going to watch this later on the website. And if you have topics that you want to see in a later speaker series, always feel free to reach out and let us know. With that in mind, I'm going to turn off my camera and my microphone and turn it over to Oren, who's going to give us a little talk. Then once we're done, we'll do some Q&A and just ask some random stuff. And I will ask stuff about that and potentially even other stuff I know Oren has done just to add some extra interest to the video file. But with that said, thank you for joining us, Oren, and we look forward to your talk. And it is all yours.
Cool. All right, so let's get into it. All right, so James just introduced me. I'm Oren Adcox. I run a small game development studio that mostly focuses on serious games. But more importantly to this, I just finished up my master's degree within like the last year or so. And my history before that is getting a bachelor and a BFA from Mason in art and game design, respectively. So I've been around for a minute, and I've gone through the Mason program quite a bit. So it's been interesting to have this as sort of a capstone for everything. So the purpose of this project is more to encourage designers to sort of think outside the box a little bit. This isn't like a fully fleshed out complete game, obviously, because this is, in the thesis project, there's this and an accompanying paper that sort of supports this, the little games that are set up in this. And this game is just meant to be seen in the larger context of design decisions. It's supposed to just start to turn the gears in a designer's mind to start to think, oh, this is how I would implement this in my game, or how I would change this thing up. Or I hadn't thought about the fact that I overuse maybe this trope a little bit. Maybe I can try something else. So there's some benefits and some risks to this. I'll analyze a little bit deeper as we go on. But I just wanted to sort of say that this is kind of the main purpose of it. Right. So it focuses on a couple different types of rooms, and these rooms are basically set in a sort of 3D action platformer space, kind of with a water temple Zelda theme and a low poly art style that you just saw. And it's mostly just to orient it as a game experience kind of first, without it necessarily being just a first person perspective that's like very limited like mechanics. It's sort of to feel like, oh, this is a template of what this game would be in like a very small form. It's almost a vertical slice of the idea of implementing these mechanics a little bit more into a game space, obviously within the limited scope of me doing a paper and a project at the same time. So yeah, the paper backs up the ideas. I kind of talk about this a little bit more and fully fleshed out, but this I'll just kind of hit on the game primarily as the examples. So the game showcases unorthodox puzzles, puzzles that highlight sort of often used design tropes and specific subversions of these design tropes. In this case, those specific subversions are usually having somebody experience something that they would normally do, and then the solution to that puzzle might be slightly different, just enough. Whereas the puzzles that highlighting the design trope is just like repeating it ad nauseum in a sense. So it's kind of really hammering home, this is the thing you do all the time, like in sort of in a limited space that makes you think a little bit more critically about it, ideally. So initially, when I was coming with this concept, I would say it originated way in undergrad, probably doing an art classes dealing with contemporary and modern art. And the reason I was thinking that is because game design itself, I was thinking as a sort of a step forward from what those were in a lot of ways, because some of the concepts that were explored in like the 60s and the 70s with a lot of the modern art has more potential in like later mediums. So in this case, this is a color field painting by Rothko. And the idea was that it might look fairly simple, but the idea was that it was so encompassing that like when you walk into a gallery, it's this huge painting and the colors kind of stretch out and it is an entire immersive space. Well, obviously, if you're here, you probably understand the game design itself is a pretty immersive medium. And I was thinking about how things like that kind of lean themselves more into the ideas explored there, right? When you have more immersion maybe that was trying to be established there with more limited tools, maybe you could do some more stuff with this. So I was thinking about Dadaism and pop art, which I'll get into in a second. So with Dadaism, I was specifically thinking of a thing called happenings, which are sort of impermanent art. They're like installations, but usually in a time period. So it'd be something that would be open to the public a lot of the times. People wander in and out. And I think about that in terms of how a lot of online games and a lot of multiplayer games kind of have the experience already. Same thing with, what the designer expectations are and what the player expectations are, because there's a lot of interplay between that. The modern art is interesting because it was the same sort of concept of like Pollock, where the artist isn't really completing the work so much as they're doing their thing, and then they have the history of the art. Whereas in some cases too, the player itself is completing the art in the same way the viewer would complete the art. That experience and that interpretation is also important to whatever the piece is and how it's seen and interpreted and dispersed to more people. And with other dispersion of art comes pop art, right? So that was the arguments between the high art and the low art, and sort of bring those up together to say how all of this kind of has value and is interesting, and has potential. I think of game design is a good example of that, because at the end of the day, a lot of games, hire products. Like, we have to be able to sell them to be able to eat, because just displaying a game in a gallery probably wouldn't feed us. And a lot of us are game designers. So I was thinking about that and how it's an interesting medium and sort of a blend and a forward movement from pop art. There's some similarities there, basically. Also, I was thinking about some of the influences of some smaller games and some from different cultures, mostly just watching some YouTubers that would cover a lot of Eastern European games, because some of the aesthetics and cultures from there were interesting. And I thought some of the mechanics they had in some of those games were different. They were novel from what I was used to. It might be collecting mail or trash from mailboxes so you can survive for a long period of time. And you would see, oh, maybe there's a hunger meter specifically. And that's like a main mechanic in some of the games that people might be used to today. Whereas in this case with, I think it was Pathologic, it was more like just one of the many things that you have to maintain to just live in a brutal world in that case. So I thought that was interesting. There's more obvious examples in this case where more metatextual, like superliminal in the Stanley Parable. Those are, more about metatext or playing with non-Euclidean space for puzzle design. I didn't get into that far because I didn't want to push into that boundary. It's a whole other thing and becomes, I think, distracting from what my point would be. But I thought the puzzle design was cool and how both of those things kind of handled limiting the player's focus so they look in one direction and then kind of surprising them or having them interested in something specific. Okay. Yeah, and I noticed with a lot of the different games that were kind of overlooked, the ones that were smaller, the UX versus experiential play might be a little bit different, where there's more things that you can explore than, just a call out to like, oh, you can interact with this fire to lay down with the grease in the ground. There's more you would explore with that space to find sort of those solutions. That was interesting. So in this context, how I'm defining unorthodox design is just kind of differing from, what the contemporary norm might be in some cases. And that might be something with a little bit more information. Things that might be considered older, outdated, I think are worth revisiting. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's almost like throwing the baby out with the bathwater in that case. It's worth revisiting some of these older ideas because, the progressive line of what game design is not linear. It usually branches off, comes back, and you take ideas from different places. It's important to understand that. Audio might be a little high. Okay, so the audio is a little loud there. But what this is a space where you walk in and there's a big button on the ground. You try jumping on that button and it doesn't really do anything. But the actual space itself is pretty limited what you can do. And I don't know if you could hear it. There's a little bit of a whir when I had the sound on that would kind of hint where this portal is. This isn't the first level you go into in the game. You actually hear that whir in previous rooms before this. So you get the established norm of, oh, that sound should be associated with the puzzle. Okay, I turned off the audio a second just because it was really loud on my end. But yeah, so you're given into this space, very limited interactions, and the idea is you explore it. So it's kind of honing the player's focus, giving them an unorthodox solution to this puzzle, but limiting sort of their interactions in there so they don't get frustrated because they only have a few options to explore. So, okay. So with the unorthodox solution, another example up there that I did was a shrinking puzzle, and that's locking a positive solution behind a negative outcome. In this case, you have to be wounded by the enemy to be able to shrink down to fit through the hole. The middle one there is the subversion of a design trope. So some examples that from earlier, and that one is basically the rule of three. Now that's a concept that's repeated through more than just game design. It's history, it's culture, it's basically the smallest group that you can have something as compared to like a pair, right? 2 is a pair, 3 is a small group, and it's as small as you can get. So that's one of the reasons it's repeated through a lot of culture. And the idea here is you hit the series of 3, you hit the series of 3, and you hit the series of 3 buttons. And it's sort of that repetition that ideally is causing the player to think, oh, why am I doing this so much? And highlighting how a lot of these times you'll do something 3 times in a row in a game. And at the end, a whole bunch of buttons rain down to sort of highlight, that's a little odd. And then the highlighting often use design techniques. So without the actual obvious raining down the buttons, this last one here is an RNG sort of drop challenge where you just have to get these keys to each door, and the drop chance for each room becomes progressively smaller and smaller and smaller. So ideally, you're getting a little more frustrated each time as you go through. So because the reward versus the challenge of it can be annoying at a time if the grind is way too long. So in this case, this is a boss fight puzzle, and there's these glowing weak points around the boss. And once you hit them, they glow and they sit there for a second and nothing happens, right? So there's this idle animation for this boss that sort of looks like it's attacking, but it's actually fairly calm. It's only once you stop attacking for at least a minute, and the trigger can be a little bit iffy sometimes here, but once you stop attacking that the boss is actually like satisfied, you get the pop-up text and the portal itself opens, right? So the idea is the solution is not to attack the boss, the solution is to stop attacking the boss. So that's playing around with the idea a little bit of glowing weak points. That's the place in the body where it might not be the thing you have to interact with. It might just be that it's something in that space that denotes something else, right? You're trained to assume that the glowing weak points are weaknesses, or that you even have to attack the boss. So in this case, this whole project kind of focuses on a mechanical ideal. In the MDA framework, that would be actually more of mechanics and dynamics. I'm just kind of leaving out aesthetics. The colloquial term for mechanics is pretty much the same thing, but this is the things that you're doing in the game and those dynamic interactions with the other systems in the game in this definition. So that those directions to the player can be more explicit. Any game mechanics sort of situate and orient the player in that space because they will naturally explore a little bit more in there and figure out, oh, what are the limitations of what it can't do? In the bottom example, you could, directly tell the player exactly how they do their controls. Or in the case of Zelda there, you could maybe accidentally light the grass on fire, see the wind patterns that go vertically that you may have seen earlier for early gusts of wind, realize, oh, that ties to my little parachute thing. I can jump and fly off of this after lighting something on fire because the hot air is rising. So that's taking some realistic knowledge of hot air going up. It's taking some of the experiential knowledge of the game experience and then seeing those repeated patterns. Since humans themselves are pattern seeking, it's worth noting when you might be able to repeat stuff to be able to drive home a point, and you don't necessarily have to say it explicitly. So both work. You just need to figure out when is the best use case for either one. And I'm not here to say you should always use one or always use the other, just to say, hey, there are costs and benefits to both here. So like I was talking about a little bit before, there's game muscles that are built up based on your expectations. And I think 3D platformers is a pretty good example here because arguably their design stagnated a little bit over the last several decades, maybe decade or so. Whereas you expect always to have a double jump, or you expect always to have a long list of collectibles in those spaces. Whereas maybe you can play with that more, right? So I think 2 games in the bottom here that were pretty successful in that were A Hat in Time, where at one point there's just a whole new R level where you have to undercover like a murder mystery on a train, which isn't something you don't really think about too much with a platformer game. You think of, oh, this is the temple level, this is the desert level, this is the forest level, not, oh, this is the murder mystery on a train level. So bringing in a little bit of influence outside of what the norm could be is also helpful to distinguish itself from other expectations. With the Mario game there, another example would be that there is a lot of movement options that you have. You have a higher skill ceiling because you're able to throw your hat, extend your chain, and have jumps that last longer. You can jump across wide areas. And oftentimes you're rewarded for that exploration where you find coins on top of buildings or an extra like star. So that novel, puzzle design is rewarded in a sense, and you're rewarded for that exploration. All right. There are reasons to not change it up, though. The obvious one being financial risk to the company, right? Players might not be familiar with this if they can't easily say, this is the first-person shooter genre. This is just like my Call of Duty. Then they might have a harder time getting into some of the ideas that you're trying to explore. This also might be harder for your marketer, depending on how big the game is, for your marketing department to understand how and what target audience you need to reach with this, because it might be something completely new. And a lot of times the first game that's into market don't really have the retention rate that people would really hope for, just because they're trying to explore a new space. So players are already familiar with an established idea in that case. And some ideas really legitimately have won out over others. I don't think a lot of us want to play 3D platformers with tank controls, but that was like early iterations on 3D platformers and what they were. So some of those design choices, especially controls, are definitely things that have evolved, and maybe you don't want to revisit some of those things because they are outdated. It's worth noting and looking back on those and figuring out why things did work and why things didn't work, though, because sometimes in a different context with new technology or a different design sensibility or just a different player appetite, you can do different things. People are post Minecraft might be more interested in exploring spaces and crafting than they were 30 years ago. So like I was saying, bad design is worth revisiting. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater in this case. And if you don't do that at all, you will risk stagnation, right? I don't think everybody wants every game to be open world, but there does seem like quite a few games right now are. And that can be good and bad. You have to consider what your design decisions are for that, how much you're exploring that space, what's your mode of travel, what information you're giving the player. Do you put icons under every tunnel they need to explore? Is some of it more experiential? Are things hidden a little bit better? How vertical is it? What's your map design? How deep are your puzzles? I know with Breath of the Wild, the temples were kind of minimal as compared to previous games. And part of that was the quantity. And is that more interesting or less interesting? You have to sort of balance those design decisions against each other. It's not to say all open world games are good or bad. It's to say, how are the other mechanics of your game being interacted with here? And what are you encouraging your player to do? It's also worth noting that these formal design structures, if you keep doing the same thing, they tend to silo themselves off. Your reference is narrow, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. But it also serves as a good counterpoint to contemporary design sensibilities. When you look back at the past and you say, oh, this is a cool idea. It didn't work super successfully, especially like games that weren't reviewed well. But I see what they were trying to do, and it's interesting. And maybe like the Minecraft example, people might be more interested in this later on. So. And with that, siloing ideas is something talked about a lot in Ralph Koster's book, which I reference pretty heavily in this paper. And he's coming at it from perspective of all games are teaching, all designers are teachers, and the players learning in that space and the rules of that space. And he talks a lot about how the things that are taught in games, like we're pretty good at hand-eye coordination at this point, we're pretty good at aiming. But what are the other things you're kind of teach? What other references are you pulling in from your life? Maybe you're making a game about how to play a guitar. Maybe you're making a game about feeling out empathy, or maybe you're even making a game where you're trying to mitigate people's emotions. For example, I know my cat is on a diet and she's very upset and yells at me often, but maybe you have to do something else on top of that. And it's good to manage stress levels. You do that a little bit with games already where you have enemy encounters and you have to decide which one you want to take out first. But maybe you can remove that a little bit more where you have less of a direct threat on your personhood and more something where it's a threat on just whatever your concentration is. So just a different context, just as an example. I also placed Miyazaki here because the often misquoted bit about anime being a mistake is interesting, but the full translation actually hints at the fact that anime became self-referential. There's a scene in the movie called Perfect Blue that's really interesting where you have the realistic characters that are walking around and then the display for anime where it's like the big eyes beyond the context of where the head shape would be pushed to like an extreme. And it's interesting to see the dichotomy between the two. It's not to say that you can't have references to that, but if everybody's reference is anime specifically and it's just iterations upon the same thing, then you might silo yourself into the same idea thinking or same methodology and ideas that you might not get from looking at different inspirations. Pokemon being a good example of being inspired by bug collecting, or Zelda being a good example of exploring caves, right? Those weren't referenced from a game specifically, those are referenced from real life experiences, and it's worth considering outside of what is your cultural diet of media, and seeing what other experiential things you can pull from. So it's a little bit wider, but just an idea. So yeah, but it's important to understand that whenever you're creating unexpected mechanics, like the RNG or the escape room, as I was calling it, with the big button in the center, that you have to limit what the player sees, because the player is always going to need some orientation in a new space, especially if you're expecting to solve something they're not used to, that isn't in their muscle memory of games they've played. So you limit their possible interactions in the puzzle space, like I mentioned before, and you usually can give them some visual and audio clues. Again, repetition is really important. If you've shown something visually or auditorily before, then maybe repeating that pattern can help hint at, oh, I need to go over here, without making it too explicit. You don't want to just have a big glowing vision over there if they hit a button. So you have to trust your player to a certain degree to be able to do some of these things. So this is just 2 times speed. Just a quick example of the button rule 3 I described earlier. You can see you just hit all of those, and I'll let it go through. But the idea is you're repeating that pattern. In this case, this is pretty standard what you expect. It's just you're hitting a button, you get some auditory feedback every time you hit it. The audio is muted in this case right now. And this one is explicit. There's big glowing buttons here because what is the purpose? The purpose is for you to just repeat this thing, not necessarily for you to uncover an unorthodox puzzle. So it was worth considering each one of these when I was making it. And I think we're almost at the end of this here. I'm just going to show the buttons raining down, and you can see that'll come. So cool. So there's benefits and costs to the players themselves. We talked about a little bit with from a designer perspective, and there is calculator risk you have to consider. And it really does factor into the same thing we've kind of repeated, where it takes players a while to learn some of these new ideas. Some people will pick up on it quicker than others. But the unexpected solutions the unexpected puzzles themselves can create novel experiences, and it can create an interesting play space where the players start to chain things together in ways you might not even expect, right? Adding a grappling hook to a game is, maybe not the newest idea, but it can really change up the entire gameplay experience when it's added to the rest of that game. Same sort of thing if you decide if you're playing Katamari and you're starting to roll things up. It's a pretty novel experience when it first came out. It was very different, not really adding one thing on top of it, but it allows for different ideas and controls and makes you start to think in a different way of what's the best way to control a giant rolling ball, maybe something you hadn't considered before. Okay, I talked about it a little bit already, but locking positive actions behind negative outcomes. Again, the purpose of this whole project, and you'll hear me repeat this several times, is to just start to get the gears thinking, or the gears turning in designers, right? It's not optimal for all games, but especially those negative outcomes can be a good teaching tool, especially when you minimize sort of what the penalty is to the player for experimentation, right? So player death is a great teaching tool in a lot of games. Super Meat Boy is a great example I can think of, where the limited time that you have between death and being able to start again is like very minimal. You're quickly in there, so you're happy to experiment and try things new, even if the difficulty is like really brutal, because you're in it and you can learn and iterate on what you've done, and you can even see all the different failures you had as you finish it. Cool. And it can also kind of change your relationship with enemies. So you're not just saying, oh, this is a threat I have to deal with. Is there a way I can utilize this? Can I use this enemy to break something open? Can I use this enemy as a mount? Can I use this enemy as a platforming tool where I can jump up to a higher space, right? It's not just a threat. It is a whole bunch of choices that I can make about this thing. And maybe it's a resource too, if you have to limit the amount of choices and jumps you have to be able to get to a new area. Maybe you're locked from the area if you can't do that. So player motivation. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is super important to really any game, and you're going to find it in any game space. It's going to be always within the context of what are the players doing, and the player motivation can deteriorate if they don't feel that the risk is worth the reward, if they feel that the loot from my boss, for example, isn't appropriate to the amount of effort they put in, especially compared to the rest of the game and maybe fighting a normal enemy, right? A lot of times players are going to take the path of least resistance, and then by just farming the normal enemy 10,000 times over rather than fighting a boss, because the boss doesn't drop good enough loot, and my mathematical chances of getting this loot from a normal enemy, which might be less fun, is actually higher. So the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. The extrinsic motivation, you might say, oh, there's a glowing thing over there. That's clearly a reward. I'm going to go over to this thing. And then maybe once you get to that place, you're like, wow, that was interesting. This is a really cool place to explore. This view is really beautiful. I want to look over at this thing over here. You'll find the same experience there, where the intrinsic motivation is the thing that you're going to want as the longer hook for whatever your gameplay might be, and getting the player to be more interested in the longer term experience with your game, right? That extrinsic motivation is a good like little seed to lead them in the right direction, a good beginning of your motivation, but it deteriorates with time if you use that consistently or too much, basically. And the loot example is a good one. So with the RNG room, that's kind of what the principle is. It's an arbitrary drop chance, and all arbitrary drop chances kind of have a half-life, and when they start to become dull, and people are going to be used to different things. I've played quite a few MMOs that I enjoy that have really grindy gameplay where you really just have to kill like thousands of enemies before it really drops something worthwhile. But it feels worthwhile in the context compared to other players because of how rare that thing is. So you have to consider what's the weight of that. And then, the unbalanced reward structures like that can demotivate the player. If you're giving somebody completely extrinsic rewards repeatedly for something you might have intrinsically enjoyed otherwise, a good example might be if you just kept giving the player skins for, playing a fighting game. And so they were interested in getting these skins, but they might have been more interested in improving their skill set if they were left alone and only rarely got something. So it's the quantity matters there in terms of how much you're giving him. And the over justification effect is a principle that's been around for quite a while, but that's the general idea of how it would apply to a game. All right. So generally, a couple of things to take away from this are design decisions themselves can be siloed from their full effects if you don't understand the context. You can pull from not nearly enough reference out in the world, and it can stagnate sort of the design decisions as a whole. Unorthodox design decision is risky, but it can prevent stagnation, right? So there's always going to be inherent risk to both the players and the designers in terms of exploring new ideas. It's going to take a minute to learn. It's going to take a while for players to understand the vocabulary being used there. And it may even frustrate some players if that information isn't clear. So there's always a risk there, but the reward is that you're not getting the same game over and over again. And people are less burnt out, and maybe they have more novel experiences. Maybe it's something that's changes the genre up enough that people are like, wow, I really like games where they might have been falling off before. And then this project, again, is meant to spark ideas, highlight and suggest a couple things, and not necessarily to say this is the best choice, this is the bad choice, but just to start to encourage discussion, because I think the medium is useful to sort of have a refresh a little bit every once in a while. And the same way that break with, to tie it back to the beginning, that break with previous art where there was more pastoral paintings and things like that became more modern art where it was breaking from that structure to try to reinvent itself a little bit and create a space that really sort of had novel experiences and sort of got at the heart of what it was. So with that, that's the general idea, the rundown of my thesis. It's about a half hour in, so I'm good to take any questions or to talk a little bit more about what I do.
Excellent. Thank you very much. If there's any questions that other people thought, you want to put them in chat, feel free to put them there, and then I will read them out and get them answered as well. And I have some that I had thought of, and as well, if some people want to raise their hand too, we can always do it that way. So you talked about a lot of cool stuff, including like, just like what you had to do to kind of go over this thesis. And so I wrote down some various questions I think people might want to know about. I'm going to do them in different orders or whatever, but so this is kind of your thesis for the graduate program. How did the graduate program and the undergraduate program, because you went through both, that experience, like how did it change how you thought about games after going through the undergraduate program and learning a little more skills-based, and then going graduate program where it's a little more research? How has that like changed the way you look at games, or has it, that kind of stuff?
It's definitely made me a better designer, because design was never my focus to begin with. It was more like, oh, the art stuff, cool, and I like putting things in the engine. Whereas now I have a better appreciation and understanding of the design itself and the psychological principles that often factor into that. to a point where if I'm playing a game and I'm like, I don't like the constant extrinsic reward that's given to me in this, I might drop it. Yeah, so that happens sometimes. And then my experience in terms of the grad degree was interesting because it was building off. It was kind of like undergrad plus, basically, where I was building off of the experience I had before, and I got to apply a lot of the stuff too, which was nice. But it was validating in the sense that, oh, I know what I'm doing here, and I can give better advice to some of the undergraduate students as well. So.
Right. No, that's good. I mean, like, so to throw it out there for people, because I'm sure there's people out there that may watch this and go, oh, maybe I'll look into a program like this. And I know we're looking to, redo our masters as well as get a PhD at some point. So how hard was this thesis in comparison to, say, projects that you did in undergraduate? It's a very different kind of a feel to them. So, like, how were they different, and how different? Yeah.
The production part, not bad. Like, I can play around with Unity all day long and make 3D assets, and it's no problem. I actually had a harder time figuring out like research. I would get notes a lot back where I was like, oh, I don't really understand what this meant, but okay. And I'd follow up on things, or I'd have a discussion. It was really good. It was just really hard over COVID times because it's like we can't meet in person, and the conversations I did have were really great, but trying to make sure that everybody had a little bit of time to carve out was tricky, just because everybody's being pulled in so many different directions all the time. But it was just sort of, and that I actually ended up graduating or finishing everything up like early summer because everything got pushed back from the spring a little bit, and that's just kind of the way it fell. But I think the challenge is both just trying to hit the communication milestones that I sort of was confused about, but it ended up working out, obviously. And that took a little bit to learn, and then just trying to figure out ways to orient my writing. And there's a couple edits I still need to do before I submit this to the repository. Just because I'm not bad at writing, but I'm definitely out of practice.
Nice. And when you say that, you had people like, giving you notes and stuff, is this, for those who aren't familiar with the process, is this presumably the people on your committee for your thesis and things like that? Okay. Yeah. And like, for those who don't know, like, what kind of folks go on to that committee? Who did you have to basically tap to for this feedback and ultimately approval of your thesis?
For me, it was a mix of teachers. You have to have like one outside source, and then so one of the teachers I had contacted a friend of theirs that gave me some really good design notes, and having those conversations was really helpful. So it was that, and project chair was writing oriented, so that was super useful, and that helped a lot. Because that was the part where I struggled, I think, with the most, just understanding how I can convey these ideas and refine them into writing, because I like to pull from all these different sources, and then it's like, oh, that's still way too big. Scale of abstraction, let me hone back down onto what a couple ideas are. And even then, it's still pretty broad for what this presentation was, but I feel like it was pertinent to what the discussion was. So.
Were most of the people on the committee then knowledgeable about the subject in general? Or did you have to ensure you could simplify it for a larger audience?
Yes and no. I'm super used to being able to simplify some things if I'm talking to people that aren't oriented in games, because that's what I have to do for a living, where I'm doing serious game development stuff. And usually talking to subject matter experts that aren't game experience. But in this case, everybody had a good understanding of games. There was some difference in terms of some depth of knowledge in specific things, which of course everybody's specialized and is masters of their own field, but might not know, oh, this is a design methodology versus this is how I would approach this artistically versus like, oh, this is how it's done in a research space. And it was interesting to take notes from each of those kind of perspectives and try to filter through my own understanding to at least come up with something that was comprehensible.
And I haven't seen any notes or hands, so I'm just going to keep asking questions till I see other ones in there. So the presentation, you showed some of your demo and some of the elements that you tried to highlight in the demo from your research. That particular demo, I assume the committee got to play it. Did you also get other people to play it? Essentially, my question is more like, what kind of feedback did you get from either the committee or other folks about the demo, and how these, changes they may not have expected came across to them?
Yeah, a lot of the some of the feedback wasn't necessarily like gameplay based. Some of it was. It's just, where your timeline of the game at being able to be in somebody's hands versus your timeline for bug fixing and getting the paper set up. I didn't get it into as many people's hands to play as I wanted to earlier on, but I, did a lot of video, showed essentially deliverables, and got a lot of good feedback on, okay, this is how you should hone the focus of whatever this room is, or what's the design question that you're asking here, or there's a couple things I'm confused about, eliminate this variable basically. One big thing I added that it was discussed about and agreed upon by everybody was adding literal signposts in every game where you could hit that in the room and it would literally be me narrating through, okay, this is my design decision, or this is what the room's about. So, and it's highlighted by the big like dev on UI feature above it that you might have seen in some of the video. So it expands on sort of what that is. So if you're a little confused about why that room was there, it can highlight a little bit more. And again, this is a little vertical slice. This isn't a fully fleshed out commercial game. It's just paired with a paper for the design context. And the idea is to just highlight those features in each room. So hopefully that answered it.
No, that's fine. I was very curious because it's, like even a demo like that would be very interesting to get feedback from folks, like you said, that are used to the norm. And that actually brings up, a different topic of questions that I'd written down, which was, you mentioned, there's all these different kinds of tropes and mechanics that are out there that are kind of standardized to this point. And I think you mentioned a few there, obviously. Are there some that in your mind should be broken or looked at being broken more?
I think,
again, this is just, you just throwing out random questions to you, but are there mechanics like you think that are used too often or researching? Yeah.
This is actually just super fresh, not necessarily something I was researching, but I know currently, this is my date, this recording, but there's a lot of discussion about how much you have in terms of UI and what you call it in an open world. So how much do you let the players explore that space versus how much do you say, oh, this is your exact distance to this thing, here's the golden light? Like, you give players options to lay markers and waypoints, but how much do you tell them directly versus how much do you let them explore, and what does that factor into the decision making? What do they find? And then a lot of that goes into level design of how are you going to railroad them to the points you need them to, while still letting them feel like it's a complete experience and world. So that's the big one that's on my mind right now.
You may want to, you can probably stop sharing your screen, that way we can see everybody's face a little bit better. Since we're just chatting anyways. And I presume, since we're talking about things like this, that you're talking about Elden Ring.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, that honestly was one of the ones that I was going to bring up as part of that. Like, there are games that do this. I don't know if it's what their design philosophy behind it is, but there are some games out there that break with tradition and either directly or indirectly, by accident or by purpose. And so yeah, that's one we're seeing a lot, I think, because people are like, game of the year, horrible UX, right? And it's like,
yeah,
how do you balance that, right?
And horrible UX in itself is a bit subjective when you think about it too.
No, absolutely right, because it's how do you gauge a user experience? And if you looked at Dead Space, a really old game out there where they got rid of a UI and tried to put it all within the space of the game, and I can't remember the term they used for that. It's some fancy design term. That was a controversial move too, right? Because it required you to do something different.
Yeah, I guess it would be diegetic in that case, right?
That's it. That's the one I was trying to think of. Yes.
Yeah, it's exactly. The diegetic UI. Yeah. Which, oh my God, I can't believe that Dead Space is super old.
Right.
Makes me feel rather old.
Although I think they're going to remaster it, so it'll be back in everybody's mind. So
yeah, that's true.
Are there other games that are out today that? Oh, and I'll see a hand in a second. I'll let Jacob ask a question. Actually, you know what? I've asked a lot of questions. I'll just let Jacob ask a question, and I'll come back to mine. So go ahead, Jacob.
Well, my question is just kind of random, but your presentation. Well, first I noticed the book. I think it's Ralph Koster, The Theory of Game Design, and the patterns and that. And I thought I might ask a question related to that. But the real question I think when you were talking about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, as an educator, that means I think, something different to me maybe than it does, because when I think of like a game, well, if they're playing the game, it's definitely probably unless they're being forced to play it, it's intrinsic motivation. And what they do in that game, I guess if you're as a game developer, if you think they should be doing something specifically, then you might need extrinsic motivation to get them to do that. But if they're going and changing skins all the time, to me, that's still playing the game. So I guess I wonder, like, is there some gray area, or is there a distinction that you make between what is intrinsic and what is extrinsic gameplay?
Yeah, it's a permeable barrier, right? It's not going to be like this all the time, because getting the skin the same as like getting a coin, where that would be an extrinsic reward, whereas the intrinsic motivation to be able to change your skin, because I want to customize this, I want to play fashion, that's something that you're exploring because you want to, not necessarily because there is an outside motivating factor that is telling you you should do this thing. So I think all games need like a healthy mix. You're not going to have completely one or completely the other. I think the purest thing where I can find where it's almost all intrinsic motivation is fighting games, because it's, I need to improve, I will be beaten down otherwise. And then you start to find the fun in that. But that's like the most extreme example. You're going to have both, and ideally you're using the coins to lead Mario where he needs to be to get to the thing, and then people, I understand where these things are to find in this game, and you start to explore that space more, partially because it's interesting, but also because you want the rewards. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, sort of. I guess
Okay.
To me, the gray area is like, if there's, let's say the skins, for instance, it seems like that is, if they're doing that, it means they have intrinsic motivation, because skins don't really help you achieve anything, right? So it's really like the fighting that to get you to level up and to get, that's really the extrinsic, that's kind of the thing that you're kind of giving them rewards for. That I guess the reward itself, if they're obsessed with the reward itself, I don't know, it's just kind of this gray area in my mind when it comes to games.
Yeah, well, that's part of it too, is if everything's seen in a level up structure where there is different levels that you go through, then that is immediately an extrinsic reward for what would otherwise be an intrinsic motivation for you to improve.
Right.
That's kind of where it goes back and forth. But yeah, like I definitely agree. I think there's a lot of commonality there where I think I agree with you on a lot of those points. That makes sense. Like there's definitely crossover there.
Yeah, like if I were collecting skins, not because I liked the skins and that wasn't my motivation, but collecting all the skins got me an achievement and my gamer score went up and I could show off that, then it's like, oh, the skins are kind of like leading to a reward that's something different. So that's my intrinsic, is the gamer score, and the extrinsic is just the skin collecting. But some people will find the skin trick collecting the intrinsic part. So it's like, as a game designer, or as a system designer, you have to think about, like, everybody's motivations are going to be different. So yeah, it's a very tricky area.
And it can be hard to sort between them.
You could almost say like everything's extrinsic motivation then, because you're always trying to achieve something in the goal. You're never just doing something for absolutely no reason. Like you're trying to achieve something. So I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I know it is a tough one. Did you have another question, Jacob, or is that it?
Well, no, I was kind of curious why you had the picture of the book in there, because I think to me, when I see that book, I think of like pattern recognition. And I guess you talked about like, recognizing the 3-button pattern. I guess you had a lot of that in there. You just didn't make direct reference to it. So
I think I tried to mention it, but it was the idea of orienting all games as basically teaching, right? So all designers are teachers, and all players are learning that experience, because they're learning the lessons of how to play the game within the game experience. It's referenced a little bit more in my paper. I definitely like talk about that a lot more in depth, really, because that's a good book. I actually learned about that one in undergrad. So Jacob, you're still muted.
Your talk also made me think about that book in the terms of, that book is about how to design a game and recognizing patterns in a game. But what your talk was about largely was like recognizing the patterns across games, which I thought was just an interesting kind of thought. But
cool. So, I mean, it actually brings up a good point, because it's like, when you're designing some of these things for your demo and for your research, right, it's like it brings up the topic or the question of like, how do you combat learned knowledge, right? People have developed either these patterns that they've developed over games, and or a good designer is also always telegraphing the mechanics for you. So how do you balance that idea of like hand-holding versus frustration as you're trying to do essentially a counter mechanic, right? That's not normal. What did you run into? Like, what were some problems or thought processes that you had to go through to kind of combat that?
Yeah, that's kind of what the idea was behind the sort of escape room with the big buttons. Like, limit everything else. What is the thing you can do? What can you explore with? Okay, there's not much I can play with here. Nothing's destructible. But if I go around the outside perimeter, I'll eventually hear a cue versus sound that I've heard elsewhere in the game that I know means, oh, the portal's nearby. So having some sort of audio or visual cue that is a repeated pattern like that, while limiting other choices, really does help sort of reinforce what that is. But you have to be very conscientious about it. And if I could say anything about, or conscious of it, and I say anything about the entire project, is that it's just conscious design. It's like, why am I doing this thing? And how does it affect the player? Which obviously everybody considers how it affects the player to a certain degree. But you really need to understand, like, what are the other factors that are affecting this player and what are the choices that they see? Because it might not be the same thing.
Gotcha. Okay. Jacob, your hand's still up. Did you still have another question or just, okay, just making sure. And so we still have a few minutes left. And I know you've done some stuff outside of the program. You obviously run your own a company here at the VSGI and have made entertainment games. You mentioned fighting games. It's one of your guys' favorites. You also have done a lot of serious games, but contracts and so on. For folks that are looking at how do you take what you learn in the undergraduate or the graduate and kind of apply it, what are some tips or pitfalls for people to think about that are thinking about like running their own business, making their own games, whether they're entertainment or serious? What are some just general tips you could throw out there as kind of a bonus to this talk? Because I mean,
let's see. Well, the business side of things, if you can afford it, hire a business manager, because if you're into games and you want to design the games, you do that. Yeah, there's a great talk, and the name's escaping me right now, but it's that eventually you get, I can't remember his name. It's going to bug me. Somebody's going to know it. But the Shell Games, where he talks about that at a certain point when you run a company, you're running the company. That's your game. You're making the game the company, not the actual game that you're making with the company. So there's a bit of that. I've done a lot of producer roles more than anything, a lot of back and forth with clients and understanding sort of what their needs are and getting that in there. And if you're doing serious games, that's a big one. But if you're doing entertainment stuff, it's similar concept, especially if you're looking to start your own business. You're probably either going to have independent funding or you're going to have to do a Kickstarter. In both cases, you have to pitch to somebody, which isn't that different than working with a client. So you have to be able to take whatever your idea is, obviously get that down to like 10 slides into your slide deck presentation, but you have to convince somebody, oh, invest in me. This is what this is. And you can probably hire somebody to help you with the pro forma and the budgetary and tax stuff. Tax is a big one. But for the game design stuff, you still have to be able to communicate your idea from top to bottom to somebody and get them on board with it at any point. And if somebody has a good suggestion, you have to be able to think about it, incorporate those, or you have to be able to push back and say, I don't think this works for this design because of this. You can't just say, it doesn't work, or we can't do that. You might be able to push something back and say, we can do that with the expansion, or that's a great idea. We might try this later on, but for right now with this deliverable, we can't make that quite yet. But so that's the biggest thing. Know kind of what you want to do when you're founding your company, figure out who's best to handle some things. Maybe you hire a couple things out for that. But the biggest thing is when you're dealing with funding or anything else like that, understand your game and be able to talk to somebody about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I know you like you said, you've mentioned working with different subject matter experts, and obviously your clientele for some of the audience, the market for the serious game or whatever is very different, right? Like, make a fighting game, you kind of know who you're making it for. when you were doing some of these, serious games, it's a very different market. You're talking, kids and education and things like that. What were some interesting design elements or stuff that you got from like subject matter experts, from the education side, that ended up potentially being counter or different than maybe some of your initial plans? Like, what were some of the things you had to implement there? And trust me, I know there's a lot that can go into that.
Yeah,
but
yeah, I can give a whole talk on that.
right?
The hardest thing is always, how is this game being played and what timetable for serious games? Because it's okay, you have 5 minutes, invest your player in the experience, evaluate them, and then get good useful data for this. Why are they not understanding this? Change your game. So yeah, it's important. But you have to consider at all points where the context is of how this game's gonna be played by the person that's playing it. And that might change. The start of the contract, you might think it goes this way, and that people immediately pick up on this. But maybe that group hasn't ever played a game, and it'll take them longer to learn this thing. And they'll go over the timetable that they have allotted at whatever business or school or whatever they have. So you have to consider, like, how are you delivering this information? Maybe you need to change it up completely. Maybe you have to cut half your narrative. We definitely ran into that before. But that's the biggest thing, is you get a lot of changes. You have to be open to changes too. The same thing goes in the pushback. You have to push back on design things that you think might undermine the core concept. But for other stuff, you have to be open to thinking about how that's going to impact the player.
And when you were doing this, did you find that that by modifying kind of these designs to match the who's going to play it, and the age of the player and all these different conceits that you have to put in there, did you find that you were tending to stick to some traditional mechanics and tropes, or did you find yourself modifying them a little bit? Like, so I'm trying to bring it back around to the original topic, right? Like, did you find yourself relying on the good old yeah, we got to do it this way, or were there things you had to do because they were a new or different kind of audience than you'd traditionally thought about?
Yeah, the part of the problem is, and I was dealing with a really young demographic that didn't have a lot of built up experience from that. So a lot of that was more relying on what is the established norm. Like, I didn't have as much freedom because it was such a quick thing where I had to think about, how do I get this lesson impacted into this person immediately. We tried to explore as much as we could with certain things. We found that action oriented experiences were more engaging than a lot of the dialogue based ones for the age group we were looking at. Which was useful, but you had to think about where, in this case, it was basically evaluating points of measure on the back end. So I had to think about where were these points of measure that, somebody would need to analyze later, coming from, because it's easier to get out of dialogue. So dialogue was sort of the crutch if we couldn't figure out anything else, but we tried to lean more towards action games later on. But it was still kind of sticking within, pretty obvious call outs, that kind of stuff. I think
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. I was trying to click the button as I was trying to talk.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, because that's interesting, right? Because I mean, you end up you're doing your thesis on like, how do we break these things and how do we do that, right? Without it being different. I mean, and are there any historical good examples you can think of where people broke mechanics and traditions and it still worked out for them? Obviously, Elden Ring's one of the more recent ones, right? But and I can think of one on top of my head, but are there other ones that you can think of that are, and you mentioned some that are, definitely play up with psychological stuff like the ones you mentioned in there, but are there other ones that you think did well and like almost established new norms?
They probably wouldn't hit a lot of smash hits. The reason I included things like Katamari was because it's like, that was novel. It might not be, AAA, like the biggest hit in the world, but it was something that everybody recognizes. It's like, oh, that's that game where you roll things up. That's weird. And then I was doing the other example where it's just kind of modifying, where you got a grapple hook to a game. It changes up the game experience quite a bit.
Right.
It might not reinvent everything, but it might change your relationship with previous titles in that experience. In this case, Halo was the example. Whereas like, man, I wish I had that grappling hook in the previous ones. So I wouldn't say as many game changers. It's really hard too, because a lot of times what happens is it'll be something completely different, but it might not be the thing that gets popular first. It's the iteration that looks at, oh, they did this thing. Now people have already studied a little bit of information, and then it becomes popular. I actually talk about Demon Souls versus Dark Souls in the paper, where it's like Demon Souls came first, wasn't very popular. Dark Souls did it, and then it was a slow fan base that sort of grew over time. So,
well, I mean, my thought was like, and I don't know if you talked about it necessarily in the paper, is Minecraft. When Minecraft first came out, like it got super popular by word of mouth and things like that, but it didn't have a tutorial.
Yep.
It was just like they threw you in a world and you figured everything out, and that's just not the norm anymore. And they actually capitulated and eventually added that in to get a broader audience. But it just goes to show you that people can still make a success by changing these norms. But at some point, you still have to think about like, how do you make it mainstream? And so it's a very interesting case study on its own, is like, how did they adjust over time to people? And was it smart to do that and things like, and people will argue that back and forth, but no, it was pure when it was like you did nothing. And I'm like, okay.
Well, it's important to, I think with Minecraft, it's interesting to say that it's not like it's not designed at all. It's just, it was experiential, right? Because like to get something, you would have to, make sticks and then do, make a pickaxe out of that. And I can make a pickaxe out of wood. And there was more experimenting there. I think probably having the crafting table later on where you start to see the patterns, you can uncover those as you start to play with it more was helpful. It's funny because I still think it's the hunger meters being a new feature, but that's been around for like 10 years now.
Right.
Because I played in like the alpha. So it's interesting. Just like, where do you start to play? And since that's, it's like a randomly generated. So you can't design as much of the levels. So you have to think about what resources would you maybe generally spawn around the player more often. So they kind of are prone to go to that thing first anyway, without forcing them to be. Another soft way of doing it is if you spawned enemies or something outside of a ring that was further out from somebody, where it encourages them, I shouldn't go that way yet. I'm not strong enough. And you go back and make armor.
Yeah. And it's like, how much do you water down the experience? It's like that first night when you get blown up by a creeper, it's like, that's a very, very big experience for some of the original players. And then you get kind of handheld a little bit. So, all right, well, we're running close to the time, but I think we learned a lot. I think it's a great thesis. I think that, again, we're never going to get innovation if we don't challenge these mechanics and kind of things like that. And how do we do that in a way that makes sense? And I think that's a great research project. I really appreciate you coming out, Oren. Lots of good information, and hopefully if people want to follow up, they're always welcome to email us and we can put them in touch and get further information. And as always, pass along this video on the website. And if you have ideas for new talks, let us know. That's it for me. Thank you so much, Oren.
Thanks.
Cool. All right. Thanks.